This is Chapter 1, Section 6. We're going to take a look at three different areas of multiplication. The first one being the inverse property of multiplication. The second one being multiplicative inverse. And the third one is the reciprocal. First, let's take a look at the inverse property of multiplication. Let's say we had a fraction, 2/3. To find the inverse of this fraction, we would take the denominator of the fraction and move it to the numerator of another fraction. And we would take the numerator of this fraction and put it in the denominator of this fraction. Now, if this holds true that this is the inverse of itself, then it should, if we multiply it together, it should equal 1. Let's take a look and see if that happens. 2/3 times 3/2 equals, well, 2 times 3 is 6, and 3 times 2 is 6, and 6/6 equals 1. So this holds true. 2/3 is inverse to 3/2. Next is multiplicative inverse. Now, when we talked about 2/3 times 3/2 equaling 1, this is actually the multiplicative inverse. But there's other ways to think about multiplicative inverse. Let's say we had the number 5. What is the multiplicative inverse of 5? Well, remember that 5 can also be written as 5/1. So if we did the same as in the inverse property of multiplication, where we switch the numerator and the denominators around, we can multiply this by 1/5. That way, if we multiply it, 5 times 1 is 5, and 1 times 5 is 5, and this equals 1, so it would be a multiplicative inverse. Same holds true if we had something, let's say, like 1/3. What is the multiplicative inverse of 1/3? Well, we know if we switch these around, the denominators and numerators, we would have 3/1, or 3, and we multiplied those together, that would be 3/3, which equals 1. These are multiplicative inverses. And last is the reciprocal. The reciprocal is nothing more than how we find the multiplicative inverse. If we had a fraction a/b, the reciprocal to this would be b/a. Or if we had 2/3, the reciprocal to 2/3 is 3/2. Let's take a look at dividing fractions. If we had two fractions, let's say a/b divided by c/d. If we were to divide these fractions, here's the rule you follow. The fraction that we're dividing by, in other words, c/d, we're going to take the reciprocal of that, and then we're going to change, instead of dividing, we are going to multiply. So this is the same as saying, let's keep our a/b the same. Let's multiply now, and let's take the reciprocal of c/d and put that in here. So if we do the reciprocal, we just flip these around, or d goes into the numerator, c goes into the denominator, and it's d/c. So if we were looking at a real fraction dividing, let's say we had 2/3 divided by, let's say 3/5. If we were going to divide this, we could take the reciprocal of 3/5 and multiply. So this is the same as saying 2/3 times the reciprocal of 5/3, which is, or reciprocal of 3/5, which is 5/3, and that would be the same as saying that. Now we can multiply this through. 2 times 5 is 10, 3 times 3 is 9, and that would be the answer to 2/3 divided by 3/5. Let's look at another example. Let's say -6 divided by 2/3. Again, we can take the reciprocal of 2/3 and multiply it by -6. -6 times the reciprocal of 2/3 is 3/2. This would equal -6 times 3 would be a -18. And then we just bring our 2 across, it would be -18/2. Or we can reduce this. 2 goes into 18 9 times, and we carry our negative. So -6 divided by 2/3 equals -9. What if we switch this around? What if we went 2/3 divided by a -6? Remember, it's -6 can also be written as 6/1, so it's 2/3 divided by a -6/1, or we can rewrite this as 2/3 divided by, we take the reciprocal of -6/1, and it would be a -1/6. Now we can multiply this through. Not divided by, this would be multiplied. 2 times -1, which would be a -2, over 3 times 6, which would be 18. And we can reduce this. 2 goes into 18 9 times, so this would be a -1/9.